Wow, thanks for that introduction, and thank you so much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be in Baltimore with all of you, and especially to engage in this interesting discussion in the context of an institution of learning, a library, and also to be surrounded by the works of Edgar Allan Poe. So I am a curator, which Jordan mentioned, and which means that I pick the art that goes in the Delaware Center for the Contemporary Arts. And I've curated shows on karaoke and country music and beer. And now I'm interested in curating a city as an exhibition. And I'm basically thinking about ways in which I can see that person over there. Move beyond the scope of traditional exhibitions and showing objects, and actually showing experiences as works of art, or experiencing the gallery as a space of dialogue and conviviality. And as Jordan mentioned, we received a Warhol grant that is for 4 interactive participatory exhibitions at the DCCA. May I move this?
Of course.
Okay. Somehow I will do that. Okay, make sure that it can reach. There we go. And so it's all based upon the theme of radical participation. And, you know, in this age of the consumable art object and the idea of taking something and turning it into a commodified, fetishized art object, I'm really interested in how we can return participatory democracy to institutions of art. So the theme that I'm working with is imperfect city, and that's the basis for an exhibition at the DCCA that starts as a conversation and evolves over time into an exhibition. It started already. We had a series of town hall meetings, and we're currently having town hall meetings every month until March, when we as a community in Wilmington come together and start to realize the actual built or constructed nature of the exhibition in the galleries. So I'm going to talk about that exhibition today, and I'm going to talk about how it fits into other types of exhibitions that are happening now. The idea of utopia is something that, you know, comes from this idea of the 60s. We have this stereotype of it as being a pie-in-the-sky idealistic idea, and trying to basically achieve the impossible in this intentional community that always ends in failure. But actually, utopian scholars would say that utopia translates to this idea of a process, and it's not a destination but a direction. Wilmington, a place to be somebody. But what does this really mean? What's interesting about Wilmington is that it's a stratified community, and it's polarized along race lines, along economic lines, and the DCCA itself is a 30-year-old nonprofit arts organization. It's a non-collecting institution, and it really has trouble being relevant to its community. And that's something that I'm here to ask you today. How can you create relevance for your institution or for your practice as an artist, as a curator, as a museum person? How do you create a certain awareness of what you do and how that matters to other people? And increasingly, institutions like the Queens Museum, the New Museum in New York, are trying to take the pulse of their communities and actually create programming that doesn't have much to do with fine art per se, the history of, you know, what institutions have done in relation to traditional educational programming, for example. And they're moving away from the idea of the traditional exhibition and into ideas of community organization, and using the gallery and the institution as a space for that idea of participation and exchange of ideas to take place. So I'm very inspired by that. You know, the Queens Museum actually has programs where they have English as a second language classes, and they offer those to the local community. I was just visiting the Queens last week, where they created a satellite exhibition, or actually they bought a house that is near their property but is more accessible, because Queens is actually located on a large plot of, you know, land that's difficult to access sometimes. And they use it, they call it the immigrant movement. And basically it's a place where, you know, local immigrants can actually have access to health care. You know, there's all kinds of programs that are set up to enable, you know, people to vote or to, you know, have access to their community. And it was a really interesting space, and the artist Tanya Bruguera, a Cuban artist, was in residence there, and she's working with the local community. So I guess the question becomes, and I'm going to back up here and show presenter tools because I have some notes, but whether or not Imperfect City can be a discursive curatorial practice that is a kind of work in progress. In other words, discursive meaning taking place in an expanded field, so that it's not just based upon curating fine art objects, but looking at design, architecture, anthropology, urban planning, you know, many different disciplines of thought to inform what you do as a curator or what you do as an artist. And then not only that, but to involve people in the creation of the exhibition in real time, so that when they walk into the gallery, it's not just a finished, beautiful object on a pedestal, but it's something that is a work in progress. So perhaps you walk in and you're actually, you know, engaged in a conversation about the nature of the exhibition and how it's actually evolving over time. And so with that in mind, Imperfect City is this acknowledged failed utopia within the DCCA's walls. There have been other people and other artists who've done this type of work before, one of which is the artist collective called Group Material, and I'm sure you're familiar with them. Many of you might be. They came out of the 80s. They were a collective in New York. And they actually engaged in electoral campaign-style advertising and organizing. And they started a gallery, and then they ended up, you know, as many artist collectives start, wanting to create a gallery, kind of like sophiajacob, and, you know, pooling their community of artists around them, their friends, and really creating something, making something happen in a particular place. So they started these town hall meetings, and as you can see, politics and election, organized Group Material, and they had, you know, guest lectures, they did seminars, and they borrowed from the tradition of 60s style activism and kind of updated it for the 80s. But they weren't really immediately accepted because they were rethinking the curatorial role, not in terms of it being a traditional managerial role, but in a way utilizing it as a space of creativity and of experimentation. So it wasn't just about selecting artists to put in a gallery, but to actually rethink the entire way that exhibitions come about. So I call them the progenitors of what discursive practice could be. And discursive practice, again, going back to that idea of not necessarily thinking of curating exhibitions proper in the form of actual discrete objects, but in a way kind of creating knowledge, education, coming together to create meaning, and it not being based upon, you know, a fetishized art object. And the influences abound in terms of this type of work, and I'll just go through and name a few projects that I've been involved in and that I find interesting and that have informed some of what I'm doing with Imperfect City. I'm involved in a gallery as exhibition as work of art called The Shaft, which is a peripatetic art gallery, and it's an interesting project. It emerged out of an elevator in Philadelphia, and basically we didn't have enough money to pay for an actual gallery space, so we just occupied an elevator in the building and basically started having exhibitions. And we anthropomorphized the gallery so that we basically started with the premise that the gallery was falling in love with the visitor. And yeah, so the shaft itself became this kind of, you know, character. And I was the curator and a paraprofessional curator, because I look at what I do at the Delaware Center as being the, you know, the straight-laced curatorial role. I still wear that role. I still wear that hat and perform that role, but doing the shaft with my partner, Lauren Ruth, who's a sculptor by training, is something else. And it allows me to, you know, be more experimental and to take more risks. So with that said, you know, because of a sort of rejection from a particular gallery in the building where we started this elevator gallery, we decided that instead of, feeling, I guess, marginalized, we would take the opportunity and utilize rejection as a form of empowerment. So we simply just occupied the elevator. We ended up doing a lot of different projects. Check out theshaftSpace.com and enjoy. This was actually one of the curatorial statements, which was a French bistro. And this was a prefix menu, which basically included the curatorial statement. And because we were getting so much flack from the locals in the building, they had a lot of reservations about whether or not we should be there. So we decided to create an intimate, public, yet private space that was now accepting reservations, a kind of tongue-in-cheek reference to the fact that we would accept criticism. Anyway, I'll move on. John Muse is a professor at Haverford and a curator and an artist, and he, along with Matthew Callanan, the curators of Haverford's Cantor Fitzgerald Gallery, created an exhibition that was based upon a game and a competition called And the Winner Is. And basically, it investigated competition. Now, the interesting thing about the curator, John Muse, is that he is trained in rhetoric. He received a PhD in rhetoric from UC Berkeley, and he was interested in the fact that this was going to be on the campus of Haverford, which is a Quaker school. And the Quakers, historically don't subscribe to the idea of competition. There's, everyone's equal on campus, ostensibly. Of course, it's for, people who can afford the actual cost of tuition there, which is not cheap. But so he wanted to create a kind of dialogue with the, if you will, PR message of the college that states that everyone's equal and that there are no winners or losers, to actually create an exhibition that would create winners and losers. And he didn't announce this to the college, but he, along with Matthew Callanan, created this Skee Ball tournament that would pair the faculty of Haverford with the service technicians on campus and all of the students. So it was a really interesting investigation of how to create community on the college campus in relation to the art gallery. And some 1,300 people actually participated in this. And what was interesting about it was that they developed a software, a particular software program that would automatically pair people to play one another, and then it would generate emails and send them to the winners of each set. And they had, I don't know how many sets of people playing. So they used the gallery as a space for the massive Skee Ball tournament involving all the members of the Haverford community. And it started March 16th and ended April 20th. And they rented the Skee Ball machines. And they paid, I don't know, $5,000 or something to get them in there. But what was interesting was that they discovered along the way that a lot of people, there was one woman who worked in the cafeteria at Haverford who had been there for 30 years, whose email and phone number and address information had never been entered into the computer. So she was kind of left out of this gaming system when they started to pair the people. And what happened was it really brought to light the fact that, there was a hierarchy of people who were visible within that community and who were invisible, and that allowed people to understand the roles and all of the importance of various roles throughout the college. But that's one aspect of the project. I mean, the other project was that it was simply a really interesting model for an exhibition. The idea of conviviality, the idea of dialogue, the idea of competition, and then at the same time a subtle critique of the specious language of the college and what it promotes as far as this idea of non-hierarchical organization, even though it's part of a stratified structure and is thousands of dollars. So there was a kind of critique embedded in the curatorial program. Another project that's interactive and involves the visitor is Toons, a project by a Salisbury University-based professor named Preston Poe. And essentially, in keeping with the history of Woody Guthrie and folk songs and this sort of election period, this is a personalized song customization and distribution system. And basically, Poe sends out questionnaires asking people, who's your favorite musician, and then you select from 3 options. And basically, he generates a folk song for you on demand and then performs it. And you become kind of like serenaded by this artist. And, you know, really getting to the idea of authenticity and media and the culture of narcissism in which we live, but also learning something about the visitor and creating inimitable experiences within the constructs of the gallery where this project takes place. And that's something that people want. They want now, more so than ever, this sense of being able to have an experience rather than simply gazing from afar at works of art. I won't spend too much time on this, but when I talk about discursive practice, this idea of informing the curatorial practice with a lot of different and interdisciplinary forms of knowledge and practices, you know, I think about Adbusters in relation to the Occupy movement and how, if we're going to talk about some of the best artists working within the field of social practice within this discursive realm, I would say that Adbusters is probably one of the greatest living artists. I mean, it sounds like a really far-reaching statement because, you know, no one wants to say who the best artist is, but in terms of, you know, efficacy, I would say that a couple of the people who founded Adbusters, this guy, Kalle Lassen, who's an Estonian, he's on the right, who's a Canadian-based thinker and the intellectual force behind, like, Adbusters in general. And he was a filmmaker, born in '42, and spent his childhood in a refugee camp. And he founded a market research in the '60s, a market research company in the '60s, and then he produced documentaries for a Canadian Film Board. We all know what Adbusters does. They're basically, you know, trying to fight media and the mass consumption of images that we experience in everyday life through the media channels, and sort of kind of, you know, using the tools of the information age to combat a kind of fascism and, you know, control of sort of the psychic space that we inhabit, and resisting ideas of, you know, the commodification of culture. And you're probably familiar with this poster, which is "What is our one demand?" And this was the first Occupy poster, Call to Arms. And I thought it was interesting just to look at the ways in which they combine, you know, advertising, design, sort of the notion of activism to create political change. Of course, there are many ways to critique Adbusters, and I'm not saying that I'm, you know, their biggest fan, because I recognize that there is a certain propaganda to any particular practice. But this is an example of how they utilize, you know, sales on their website to generate a commentary about democracy. So they're selling this corporate American flag, which is a beautiful, edgy work of art. And they've hosted interactive competitions where they ask people to, you know, create this idea of a utopian flag that would appeal to people who, you know, basically need to come together under one sky. So this was one of the submissions for the One Flag competition. So, and again, this idea of engaging audiences in an interactive way to create democratic exchange, I think is very much in keeping with what is happening in the sphere of contemporary art. This is an artist, Emily Erb, who created a dollar bill out of silk fabric. And essentially we actually created, we did a flag raising in the Shaft Gallery, where on a main thoroughfare in Philadelphia, and erected this flag. This is an example of, you know, Shepard Fairey's original poster kind of being filtered through the Occupy movement, and this is Guy Fox, who is, you know, the symbol of the Occupy rallies of 2011. He was a famous figure who tried to blow up the House of Lords in the 17th century. And so anyway, going through that, you can see a lot of artists who are working with this idea of branding, of advertising, and these are just some examples. Martha Rossler. So people who are working in a contemporary vein, but still thinking about ideas of activism. And I think there's some kind of, you know, interesting commentary about art as activism and activism itself. And I think that for the most part, we're thinking in terms of social practice as being activism itself rather than art about being an activist or having some kind of political message. And with that said, you know, I go back to Adbusters and the way that they were sort of instrumental in spearheading this political occupation and making actual change happen. Thomas Hirschhorn is another artist who does these polemical installations where, for example, this is the Universal Gym, and ultimately a critique of the kind of Olympic training that we engage in as Americans to create the perfect human, focusing on our kind of narcissism rather than actual change. But he's known for agit-prop and these sort of propagandistic installations, many times, like in this case, having to do with, you know, war and the juxtaposition of the beauty culture, beauty industry, and war. But this, I think, stands in contrast to somebody like Anton Vidoe, who used the platform of a biennial to create an exhibition as school, as work of art, and utilized this model. It started out in Berlin at the United Nations Plaza, and then came to the News Center in New York, the New Museum in New York, where he held a series of symposia, lectures, that sort of thing, to really call into question the idea of these blockbuster biennial exhibitions. So using that idea of the curatorial platform as a way to totally overturn traditional structures of curating and create a different type of engagement that was participatory, interactive, and that formed knowledge. So you couldn't say that it was a traditional exhibition of objects. Another artist who's working along those lines is Fernando Garcia Dorry, who actually created a school in a rural part of, I cannot remember exactly where it was, I have to double check, but shepherds, basically. And he created a shepherd school, and his whole motivation is to create this new ruralism. So this idea of returning people to the rural and teaching a form of education of a lost art, something that's actually dying out, and taking artists who want to learn about this tradition from urban centers and taking them to this shepherd school in the mountains, where they basically learn, you know, animal husbandry and that sort of thing. It's interesting because the ancient Greeks thought of shepherding as being along the lines of, you know, political, philosophical inquiry, because you could still think while you were doing this sort of, you know, manual task on some level. And so this idea of the shepherd is this elevated kind of, I guess, rural worker. But nevertheless, this artist was utilizing the idea of a school, and the rural school, essentially. So he just received a major award from Creative Time. I attended that Creative Time Summit. How many of you went to that? Anybody go? It was pretty interesting. It was boycotted, actually, and you know, that created another form of controversy during the whole project. Here's another example of Martha Rossler, who, you know, was a major feminist artist and then continues to be, started in the 70s, and now is the subject of a major exhibition at MoMA, where she's going to have this garage sale. And she was one of the early progenitors of working within museums to create interactive social engagements, utilizing the exhibition as a platform for that type of engagement. This is an image, and she basically curates all of the items that'll be in the exhibition, and people are encouraged to come in, barter. It comes out of a feminist practice because she found that most people doing garage sales back in the 70s were women, and she wanted to privilege women's work. She wanted that to be part of a dialogue within the context of an arts institution. How am I doing on time? Fine. Okay. Suzanne Lacey also is somebody who's worked in the context of interactive and performative exhibitions, and this is 3 Weeks in May, which was a performance in 1977. It involved looking at the myths of rape. Suzanne Lacey continues to work along those lines. Today she did an LA rape map back in the 70s that she's since updated, and is working with the Los Angeles Police Department to create an updated version of the rape map. And So this is another way that she's involving the community. And she's been a big influence on Audrey Chan and Ilana Mann, two artists who have restaged the same piece doing protest, essentially, and trying to bring awareness the violence against women using agitprop and performance in a socio-political context. And, you know, they were inspired by the Occupy movement and created these wearable signs. And, of course, there are many other artists who have worked along those lines. And I'll just kind of move on. This is Pablo Gura, who is a great progenitor of the idea of making discursive exhibitions, and he's the curator of education at MoMA. This is him performing We All Need a Pygmalion, based upon the story Pygmalion. And it's a performance work that accompanies presentation of his Manual of Contemporary Art. And this is a book that's presented in the form of a social etiquette workshop for the art world. And the audience is led through a series of examples on how to best dress, speak, and promote oneself discreetly within the art world. And, you know, Pygmalion is all about class as a story, and taking somebody who's basically, you know, someone who doesn't have etiquette or training and turning them into somebody who does, as a social experiment. And this piece has been performed all over the world in lots of different institutions. And I guess the interesting thing about this guy is just that he works in so many realms. He works as an educator, but he's also a musician. He's also a performance artist. He's an actor. He's a writer. He's written books on social practice, and you know, and he's a satirist. He created this book that's about etiquette. And I think that's what's so interesting about artists working in social practice, is that they can move in and out of these fields in a really compelling way that addresses the most important, pressing, you know, ideas of class, of the constructs of the art world, the art market, what it takes to be an artist in the world today, and still at the same time uses it to actually educate people and create a pedagogical practice. So I'm very interested in his work. And then there's Michael Rakowitz, who does Enemy Kitchen, who creates this interactive platform for people to actually sample from a food truck foods that are from countries that the United States is currently in conflict with. There's also a conflict kitchen that was at the summit, Creative Times Summit. This is the artist Michael Rakowitz engaging with students. So he teaches students how to make the traditional foods from these countries that the United States is at war with or in conflict with. So getting back to the idea of the city as exhibition, and this idea of the utopian dream, the people who are involved are basically thinkers, philosophers. There's a woman in the show who is a utopianist. She has written a book called Earth Perfect, Nature, Utopia, and the Garden. And one of the things that we're doing within the exhibition is inviting a University of Delaware professor to create curriculum for the exhibition in the form of an interactive garden that her students will actually produce as part of the exhibition. And another artist who we're working with is Eric Lashinsky, who is not only an artist but a shrimper. He started a shrimping company in Texas as part of his artistic practice. But this is a piece that he did called Museum of Missing Places. It's a museum of city life addressing contemporary issues of urban place identity. So this was in a rural place, and he was invited to create something. So he created this idea of an urban environment, but articulated within the rural sphere. So looking at a way to, I guess, parody the institution of museums. That's something that he's very interested in. Another person we're involving is Marshall Brown, who's an architect in Chicago, and he's made a studio where he invites people in the community to talk about ideas of urban infrastructure and planning and community. So he's kind of creating a community hub. And so his work will inform the future of the exhibition. Ashley John Pigford is a designer. This is an example of some of the design work he's done, and he created a park that has a sound component and basically, records and provides feedback in the form of this sound installation, utilizing all kinds of speakers and equipment. I go back to the idea of Tom Marione's drinking beer with friends being the highest form of art. He was a big influence, and I did a show of his work where he created this beer bar and people went in and essentially, shared a beer, talked, engaged, and enlivened the space, brought life to an otherwise kind of austere museum, the Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati, where I was working. And this is a show that I curated, as I mentioned. I've worked on shows that involved beer, and this one is karaoke. It was American Idol, Contemporary Art and Karaoke, and essentially it turned the exhibition into a reality TV show in which the visitor became the star of their own reality TV show. The idea was basically to get people off their couches and into the gallery to use voice as a kind of medium within the exhibition. So we had a karaoke cafe and a motorcycle race powered by human screams. It was great. Other institutions that are currently engaging in this kind of interactive work are the Smart Museum at the University of Chicago, and they did a series of projects called Radical Hospitality, and thinking about how the museum can actually create conditions for people to feel welcome, and that's the crux of a lot of artists' work today. It's the idea of how to use the visitor as a way to complete the artwork, not just to have them produce it, but actually through the engagement, reposition them as active agents rather than passive recipients of an image. And this is the show called Feast. So it included a lot of different opportunities for people to eat within the gallery, share, break bread. Another example of artists who've dealt with the idea of utopia and participation are, is part of this Utopian Station, which was the 50th Venice Biennale. And this was a curatorial program that belonged to Molly Nesbitt, Hans-Ulrich Obrist, Rear Createur Venezia, and it was called Utopian Station, and it basically had 160 artists who were kind of cluttered in this space, who were creating interactive engagements. Now, this exhibition was critically considered a failure, actually, and but that's also in a way because it's it was a jumbled, chaotic sort of installation that didn't necessarily involve, looking at objects. So I question the critics' panning of this exhibition because I think that people are used to a certain church-like environment within the context of museums. And these types of exhibitions, I think, disrupt people's comfort zones. But some of the criticism was that I guess that there was a critical kind of heavy-handedness to the curatorial role. That's certainly a criticism that one could levy against curators who are trying to create these types of exhibitions, right? And that's for people to decide. I don't know. I think that it's interesting to to think about what we decide to be too much of a directed experience, and whether or not the role of the curator is one of artist or creative. I think that that's subject to interpretation, but I also think that the curatorial role is one of education and engaging people in a different way, in a novel way. Another artist who was part of that exhibition was Hu Han-ru, who did this piece called Zone of Urgency, and it seemed again, kind of like the spectacular funhouse. But it disrupted the quiet of the traditional somber gallery space and created a way for people to actively engage. We're still new, I think, new in coming to these types of exhibitions, but I'm really confident and excited to think about Imperfect City at the DCCA as a way to involve people in kind of realizing within the context of an exhibition the reality they want to see within their cities reflected in the context of the gallery space. And anybody who's involved in this exhibition is considered a cultural producer, is considered, if you will, an artist. But I'm trying to move away from that idea of everyone being an artist and more toward the idea that everyone is a cultural producer. So the next meeting, the next town hall meeting is in Wilmington. It's next Thursday from 6 to 7:30, and I'd love to have your input on what you would imagine your ideal place looking like, what it might include, and I'd love to invite you all to come check it out. Thanks for listening to me. Appreciate it.
We have about 5 minutes if anyone has a question for Maiza. Sorry to make it difficult.
Sure. Yeah, anybody have a question, criticism, complaint? Yes.
What is the structure or format of a town hall meeting?
Well, the town hall basically is an opportunity for people who come to understand how exhibitions are made and conceptualized and how many players are involved within the museum itself. So we invite all of our staff to actually be present. So the preparator, the curatorial associate, the people like, the special events manager. Interestingly, when you're trying to create an exhibition of living as form, where people can actually eat in the galleries, for example, it's interesting because you start to brush up against, as a curator, against other departments that are in charge of these things traditionally. So like special events, for example, has a caterer, and the caterer is supposed to make food for everything that happens in the museum. But what if you have an artist who considers him or herself a chef, who wants to make the food? Well, then it becomes a question of giving the caterer, the institutional caterer, the right of first refusal so that they don't lose business, or they'd make the decision to basically not take that project on, and then the artist can actually make the food. So I always have these debates within the museum, because it's like the structure of the museum can't really come up to speed with what's actually happening artistically. They're still in this retrograde mode of thinking about sculpture, painting, that's art, but food, what do we do with that? So it's a huge institutional conversation. So the point is, within the context of this exhibition, which is living as form, and I'm borrowing that term from Creative Time and Nato Thompson, the way he talks about slowing down the fast-paced life that we live and creating a sense of real-time engagement within the gallery, in which you break bread, or you actually live. You do the things that are part of ordinary activity that wouldn't necessarily be considered artistic. It's an institutional conversation, and I think it's really beneficial for people who come to the meetings to witness that, participate in that, and try to grapple with it. I mean, people came to the first town hall meeting. Actually, Sophiajacob came, and it was interesting because people were like, well, we've got a terrible crime problem. What are you going to do to solve it? And I'm like, this exhibition cannot solve Wilmington's crime problem. This exhibition cannot be, it's an acknowledged failed utopia. So, and then people don't show up to say yes. You give people an open platform, and they don't necessarily come to tell you all about what could be and the beautiful hopes and aspirations they have for the city. They come to complain. And that's sort of like, I guess, a constraint or something that we grapple with from a curatorial standpoint, how to get people away from thinking literally about the interpretation of utopia. Does it have to mean that we're going to have like Jetson cars of the future where people are microwaving their coffee just like turning over and pressing a button, or some kind of utopian thing where everything's easy? It's the idea of basically, like Buckminster Fuller said, it's dangerous not to imagine anything less than utopia, because if you're not trying to get there, you're never going to improve the conditions. Now, when recently I went to the curatorial intensive at Independent Curators International in New York, and they were critical of this whole thing because of the Imperfect City show, because they're like, well, there's a conflict between, or a tension between the conversational element, the town hall element, and then how it emerges as an exhibition in the context of the gallery. And they're like, you don't know what's going to happen. Like, I mean, how do you take responsibility for what's going to happen in the gallery? And my feeling is, I don't know. And the curatorial goal of this is to deconstruct my own authority as someone who doesn't have the end goal in mind, who doesn't know, who's informed by the visitor, so that we make meaning together and we realize it together. So, you know, to actually know where it's going, I think would be disingenuous to a certain extent. So it's a huge risk, and I think that that's what's exciting about it for me. But then they further urged me to actually take this real thing that, you know, happens in the form of an exhibition in the gallery and actually make real change in the community. So I'm a little divided about that. You know, like, basically she said, well, if people are complaining about crime, then you should actually, you know, make the institution fight crime within Wilmington. And I'm like, so I'm going to become a police chief? You know, I really fear for the citizens of Wilmington if that's the case. So, but I do think that's exciting too, because it'll force me out of my comfort zone. And it would be like a really wild ride, which I'm really excited about, because I basically want to get paid to do something that's really interesting and scary all the time. So, or to drink beer with friends or sing karaoke.